the PowerPoint? Because, you know, I don't want to go over things that seem clear to you. In other words, the idea of, you guys from the yeshivot understand, the idea of Chazorah is personal. You have to go over it yourself until you say, I understand all of this. So, people have a chance to go over it and feel that...
I didn't look at the blog.
You don't get the blog, okay.
I didn't say I don't get it, I didn't.
You didn't, okay, so you haven't looked at it.
I might be being me at saying others who are want to talk about.
Okay, so in other words, we're going to go over quickly. Now, the idea of quick is not to skip over things. In other words, if we run into something that seems not 100% clear, think to yourself, if you were going to tell somebody else what I've learned the last semester, not what I've said, what you've learned, what you have to say, what you think about it, that's the point. Because we want to, you know, we're doing this course not so that you hear what somebody else thinks, so that can encourage you to figure out what you think. Because when you're in the room, you're doing the thinking with the client. Let's go over it briefly, and we'll see where we need more. Oh, that's why it wasn't working. Okay. So everybody plug themselves in, and off we go. Remember that we began by talking about multiple function, and what we said there was that any psychic phenomenon, anything that goes on, it could be a dream, it could be a symptom, it could be a thought, that it always can be seen from different perspectives. And the different perspectives are also contradictory. In other words, there's the perspective of what's being expressed and the reaction of the person to. We'll just give a second. Wow. Congratulations for starting rather well on time. We're starting with a brief review of what we've done up until now. There's a balance between what needs to be expressed that I don't really feel belongs to me, that's what we call the drives, the unconscious, and what I think about it and how I'm trying to balance it. And that's in the realm of what we call the drives, of the superego, of the repetition compulsion, and of reality. And the reality, that part of the meaning, is what we call pragmatic meanings, right? And so this course is not saying there aren't inner meanings that are interesting and can be worked with. What this course is working on is the pragmatic meanings. The pragmatic meanings are the meanings that something has in my family, right? Now, you can have a certain dream, but when you tell your mother the dream, so that's a communication in the family, and it means something in terms of how people understand each other and how people interact. It may resolve something, it may open something that's not so open. Those are the pragmatic meanings. Pragmatic meanings is an important term. Are we all together with it? If not, are you making a face like, right. Pragmatic meanings, if you recall, what we mean is that we're talking about how things happen, not why they happen, how they happen. It's as if we're looking at the family and saying, okay, you told your mother the dream, and then what happened? She went and talked to somebody else. She told your sister went to the grandmother. Oh, how does that work? You see what I mean? It's results of something that happened, not explaining why. Why it happened is in the subjective meanings. Those are the ones that we talked about usually in psychotherapy, or individual psychotherapy. The subjective meanings are about causes, pragmatic meanings are about results. You look and you see what happened next.
It's not objective.
You could call it objective, yeah.
Like, this is how it's like the function, and it's not blaming anyone, it's more like this makes this move too, like if he does this, she does this, and this is how this.
Right. See, why do we call it pragmatic instead of objective? There's no good reason, but the word objective in English generally refers to something that is static. And we're talking about something that's in motion. Pragmatic meanings move. You know, after this, then what happens? So you can see it in the outside world, but it's a series of things that happen.
Whilst objective is just
Subjective.
objective stands.
Subjective is how
Objective versus pragmatic is objective. Pragmatic is the movement and how it works, and
Right.
objective is I have an outside stance to like stance there.
yeah, right. You see, when you say objective, objective is the most complicated word in the English language, except for God, which is a complicated word. But objective is a very complicated word because it has different philosophical meanings, and the word is a derivative from Latin. It means something different than the Latin translated to Greek. It's a complicated term, but usually speaking in current day American English, which is English, British English sometimes is different in these sorts of things. In American English, when you say objective, it's as if everybody agrees.
Oh.
And when you say objective, it's as if it's simple. Pragmatic is not everybody agrees. People could see it differently. And it's about motion, about things that people could see differently. So that's why in family therapy we prefer to use pragmatic. But it's about the outside world and about results. The way to understand it is by observing it. See, when you ask a client, she said, oh, you know, my mother came and complained to me about her father, about my father coming home late. Well, if we wanted to say, how did that make you feel about your father? That's in the subjective realm. If we wanted to say, and then what happened? Okay, so she told you, who did you tell? Right? That's tracking it pragmatically. That will show you where it goes. Well, I told my older brother. So you see, there's a triangle: mother, daughter, and older brother. Yeah.
Is it almost like concept versus process?
You could say that the pragmatic is about process, but you see, when you think about the inner world of people, the way that inner psychotherapy is handled, that's all about process too. You see,
So like the house seems like it'd be the content, and the
Sorry?
like the pragmatic would seem like it's the content, and the subjective would seem like the process.
No. Pragmatic is process in the sense it's something that's moving around, something that you follow, right? It's not just something. Content is a different way of talking. That has to do with when my mother told me about my father, what did she say? What was the content of it? The process of it is, where did that go? Okay.
Why would it be pragmatic to say how the person felt about their father? Wouldn't that be a direct flow, just like telling somebody the emotions that they felt? It's not subjective about the causes and the interpretations. The reality of either I'm going to tell my brother that father came home late, or I was angry at my father for coming home late.
Right. So the words that you're saying now that everybody's heard, and everybody would hear the same words, that's objective. The content of that objective statement is subjective. It's about feelings, right? The content. But the what you say is objective. And if I choose to use that as a demonstration in the class, so that's pragmatic. That's where it's gone from here. Okay? These are important words. They'll help you to separate when you're listening in a session. Am I dealing with content or process? Am I dealing with subjective? Am I dealing with pragmatic? People don't separate them. Your clients will come and say, my mother drove me nuts this morning, and then I went and told my brother. Oh, well, that's drove me nuts. Nuts, that's an interesting word. That's an important, deep word. So let's hear about nuts, you know. That's the inner subjective world. And then you told your brother that's not the inner subjective world. That's the pragmatic world of the family, right? And then what did your brother say? Well, a psychoanalyst would say, who cares what your brother said? That's not about you. We only care about what you felt before you told your brother. A family therapist adds to that, doesn't delete the fact that you felt something, but adds to that, what did your brother do? Oh, he went and smashed my father. Oh, okay, I'm beginning to understand the certain family dynamic here, right? So the pragmatic meanings or results is done by observation, and when a person does not understand the pragmatics, you see, a person will say, my mother came and told me this, and what did you feel? I don't know what I felt. I just felt confusion. Well, let's spend the next 6 weeks figuring out what you felt. You know, did you feel this? You know, you had a dream. Because it's important to try to understand the personal unconscious. The personal unconscious is repressed. It's not just that I don't know it, I don't want to know it. If you wanted to know it, you would know it. I don't want to know it. Because it makes me into a conflict about what I feel about my father and my grandfather, God knows what. And so it needs time, it needs anxiety, because when a person suddenly knows something they didn't want to know, there's a reason they didn't want to know. It makes them anxious, it makes them feel in conflict. So when they start to know what they didn't know, you're dealing with a person who's in the pain. Pain. You have to deal with the pain. The group unconscious of, and then, is that what usually happens, that you tell your brother? As a matter of fact, it is. Oh, so how is it that you always tell your brother? And you say, he's always standing outside the door waiting to hear. You know, when he sees Mom come and talk to me, he stands outside the door. Oh, had you noticed that? Not, now that I think about it, he's always standing outside the door waiting. I didn't notice that before. Was that repressed? No. That's a group process. The same as in this room. It's impossible to keep track of all the roles of all the different people in a group, so it's always partial knowledge. Pragmatic knowledge is always partial, and when we complete the cycle and we explore it, we usually are not dealing with things that are repressed. It's not something I didn't want to know, it's something I didn't notice. And as a result, in family therapy, when someone says, how about that? I hadn't noticed that. You say to yourself, but where's the anxiety? It wasn't repressed. Why should there be anxiety? The opposite is the case. You're enhancing the ability to understand. And so the person feels enhanced. They don't feel anxious about it. So the personal unconscious is repressed. And when you discover something that somebody didn't want to know, they feel bad. When you complete a cycle and help them to see something that they hadn't noticed but hadn't repressed, then they feel better. They start to feel that they are understanding something more about their life. So far, so good? That's a serious question. So far, so good. We're all together? Okay.
Just one second. I can still imagine that the question.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I can still imagine that question of did you notice?
Can you guys hear the question? A little louder.
I can still imagine that the question of did you notice whether your brother was always there outside could also produce anxiety, because the person will then think about what that means to them as well.
Yes. Very good. In other words, these things are not absolute. All of the distinctions we're making in this room are artificial. All of theory is artificial. Theory does not hold reality. Language does not hold reality. So it's always in some ways artificial. It's to help you to ask that question. Say, wait a minute, it could be pragmatic. It also, maybe we should talk about what you feel about your brother, what you think he feels about you. Oh my God, I don't want to go there. So, so it's not that one separates from the other. It's different ways of looking that help us to explore in different ways and understand different aspects of communication. But they're not absolute. Absolutely, right.
I think even that anxiety of sort of thinking about the brother being out there, it's different than sort of going straight to the core of what the person was feeling at the time and trying to dive into that.
Right.
It's a very, the defense response may be much stronger.
Right. Well, you see, you can say, oh, I never thought about that, but he is always standing there. Oh my God, he's standing there. So the one doesn't, but there's different aspects of it. Okay, yeah.
Also, the way I'm hearing it is sometimes the pragmatic could sort of be like the bridge to the subjective. Like, for me, it's explaining a lot of, what I call it, the schmoozing that we do in session. Before the client's ready to go deeper, there's a lot of other work that can be done before that deeper place can be touched.
Right. So one way to hear pragmatic, it's an important point. The usual way that individual therapists hear pragmatic information is it's a means, it's not the ends. Okay, we're going to hear all that, then we're going to get to the therapy, which is what you feel. That is not family therapy. That's individual therapy. Family therapy, in addition, not instead. The first family therapist thought it was instead. We're way past that. In addition, we can say, wait a minute, what would you want to change in those pragmatics? And how would you want to change it? And who would you talk to in order to change it? And then we're talking about a different way of changing relationships, not changing how I feel. Does one, the pragmatic, have priority over the others, the subjective, or vice versa? No, that's how people are. People live in these two different realms, and then you make choices about how you're going to deal with it. Whether you want to invite the whole family in and try to change the pragmatic cycles, and say to yourself, maybe the inner feelings will change afterwards, after the pragmatic cycles change. Or vice versa. Or say, well, we can't possibly change something until you understand it and know how you're feeling. Does anybody have the answer to that? There is no answer to that. Because in therapy, you do what works. And sometimes the individual way of doing things, the subjective world, is helpful for the client and the other one is not. And sometimes what's available and helpful at first is the pragmatic. But one doesn't negate the other. Yeah.
I'm saying, you're saying like you need a balance of both. It sounds like one is like working outside in and one's like working inside out.
All of therapy really works both inside out and outside in. And the question is how you understand what you're doing. This is about how you understand what you're doing. A lot of times you'll do it intuitively. And then afterwards, or in supervision, say, why did I do that? You know, what was I trying to get to? What was helpful? What wasn't helpful? But yeah, I mean, most therapy works, when you're seeing the whole family, it's not like you don't ask people how they feel, right? It just depends on which direction you're trying to get to. So far we're okay? Okay. Is this helpful for you? I mean, if this is just chewing over old stuff. But what I want to do, see, now you've been doing therapy here for a semester, right? So what we want to do now is to pull this together with your experience with clients. So you can say to yourself, when I see somebody who I can think of, where was the subjective, where was the pragmatic, how did it work? We're trying to pull it together now with people who are working, yeah.
Me personally, it helps very much when you explain the words, because sometimes like there's one or two words that I don't understand, and then I don't understand the whole concept. So I'm happy to have
Okay.
that.
No, that's very important, because a lot of times what you do when you start in theory is you kind of get it. You kind of get it. The guys in yeshivot know about that. You know, you kind of get what this is about, but you don't really get it. You can't nail it. You can't say it in a simple way. And then once you say, wait a minute, that's what this term is being used. It's being used this way here. This is what this term means here. And then I can understand exactly what's going on. So in therapy, we never understand what exactly is going on, but we can try. You know, the closer we get to, at least in theory, the closer the better. So if there's any words that are troublesome, and as I said, sometimes it's troublesome because Americans and Australians and British people use the terms differently. So bring it up and we'll try to translate it across. Then, yeah,
Can you just give another example, because it's not like solidifying for me on.
another example of?
Just this, like what you did before about the subjective and the pragmatic.
Right. So you're sitting in a room with a couple, and the man says to his wife, he says, I feel that you always need me to be strong, and I'm not always strong. Okay. Now that is a subjective statement, isn't it? Right?
Rejection.
And the woman says, that is a bunch of nonsense. The real issue is you don't think I accept you at all. And you're always attacking me. Oh, I'm sorry, the woman says you're always attacking me. Now, subjectively, he's made a statement. Pragmatically, it works as an attack, which is not so helpful, right? An attack is about you. He made a statement about this is how I feel. She takes it as an attack. Now, why does she take it as an attack? Because it usually is an attack. In other words, he's behaving good in the therapy. But at home, it doesn't sound like, I wish you could accept my weaker parts. It's you can't accept me. It's like an attack, right? So when she says it's an attack, that's seeing it pragmatically, right? And then if you would say to yourself, when you feel attacked, you see where we're going? When you feel attacked, who do you talk to? My mother. Oh, and what does your mother say to you? She says, I told you beforehand you're making a mistake. Oh, so now we have a triangle where when he wants to say something, it works as an attack and makes the triangle, the wife with her mother, stronger, and that's pragmatic. Right? Now, each of those moments could also be subjective, but that will be pragmatic. Where does it go?
So he's giving the subjective, and the pragmatic is how she's receiving it, would you say?
Right.
Okay.
Or you could say how he usually says it, you know.
Yeah.
And so then you would say, well, you know, if we could turn it from an attack into something else, what could it be? Right? Then you're getting back to changing the communication between the two of them.
That's clear.
Which brings us to the next point, which is that when we're talking about the self, see, he's making a statement about himself. There are times when I feel weak, and I wish you could accept me when I feel weak. Now, we like to think that the self is just inside of our bodies and our minds, but the self belongs to a singular person. And one of the things that we were trying to learn here about the self-object is that that's not actually the case. If you want to talk about content and process, you would say that the self is also an interactional process. Now, that is a good way to make language confusing, because the way we use the word self is as if we're closing off the world and going inside, you know, inside the submarine of only subjective experience, right? The idea of the self-object is that that actually is not the case. That from the time that we're born and throughout life, the self, the feeling that this is me, depends on relationships with others. It's mirrored and it's echoed and it's supported by how other people treat us. That's what's called the self-object. Remember that? It's better to go over that, because when that's Cohen. When Cohen first said it, everybody said, we don't know what you're talking about. And they said that for 20 years in New York. So it's not a small matter. And we said, what are you talking about? The self is inside the self. That's the part that's internal. And Cohen said, but I don't see that with my patients. With my patients, I see that there are patients, and actually all of us, that are vulnerable. We lose the sense of self when it's not getting mirrored, when it's not being reflected back in a positive way. We need each other to make the self work. Now,
Is that something that is basically built in childhood, or even if a person has it in childhood, they can lose it later on if they don't get the support for the self?
It's the other way. In other words, that's something that every mother knows, that their baby at 6 months is not an independent self. So how is the self being built? In interaction with the self-object. What is the self-object? That's where the word object shows up again, right? Something outside that's experienced as something inside, right? So when the mother says, eat, so the self feels hungry, and the mother is helping the self to feel satisfied. And when the mother picks up the fetchy baby and hugs him and says, you're not alone, you know, I love you, and that's something that he can't do by himself. He needs the other person. That's the object, the other person, who's acting as if it's part of inside of himself, right? And over time, that becomes internalized, right?
Yeah.
Over time, but when it becomes internalized, up until COVID, psychoanalysis was, one might say, overly determined by male thinking, that once you internalize things, you don't need people. You can become, that's the great American dream of independence. I don't need anybody, right? That turns out to be a myth. And that even after you're pretty good at feeling good with yourself, still, for example, the person who stands in front of a class, supposedly, you know, is like what's normal, but okay human being. If I get the wrong kind of eye contact from you guys for 30 seconds straight, I start to go nuts. In other words, things start to feel like, and it's not like I say, oh, this is a bad class. It starts to feel like, something starts to fall apart inside, right? So the coherence, the glue that keeps us is actually more vulnerable than men used to like to think. Women knew it all along. COVID tried to translate it into this term, self-object. And then he realized that it was a lifelong process. So the self is always being reconstituted. The self is always being supported, and in two ways. Cohen didn't have two ways. Stern added that when he looked at babies. The first way is the regulatory way. Everybody remember what regulation is? So there's a regulatory self-object. That's the mother who decides for the baby what the baby needs. Is she forcing it on the baby? No. He needs it. He needs a regulatory self-object to stop crying, to be able to eat, to feel interested in the world. She seduces him into being interested, and he needs that. But she's directing him. Regulation is that she's directing what the baby needs. And then when that is pretty much usual, in other words, that the mother and the baby have kept this going, it happens without being the focus of what they do. Then the baby moves from mother being interested in baby to baby being interested in mother. When the baby starts to be, remember the story I told you about, he climbs on the counter and starts to look out the window where mother's looking. The baby starts to be interested in the mother. Well, the baby is regulating the mother? No. The baby is looking at the mother's subjective world. That's what we call intersubjective. In other words, now the baby is saying, you're a subject, and if you're a subject, then share it with me, so I can be a subject too. That's why we say that the mother is the baby's first subject. Now, confusing sentence, you couldn't find a more confusing sentence, but that's the point, that the first subject for the baby is mother. She shares her subjectivity. She says, oh, look, there's a tree. And the baby says, oh, well, look at that. It's not the tree that interests me. It's that you're seeing the tree. And if you're seeing the tree and can communicate that to me, that's what a subject is. So I can show you a doggy. And you can say, oh, look, a doggy. And that's intersubjective, right? So the second level of the self-object is intersubjective, where people share their subjectivity. Yeah.
What really happens is that when the child sees the mother looking out, and he can give himself permission also to look up, like the baby can see also. What happens?
What happens?
Does that work?
How does that work? I don't think we know yet how that works. But
I mean, like, what is the subjectivity? Like, so the mother is my object, and then I'm learning that she can see things. So she's giving me permission also to see things.
Yeah, she's sharing with me what she's seeing. There's a mother who says, you stay on the floor, I'm looking out the window. Instead of saying, oh, let's look out the window together, is keeping the baby regulated, right? But the mother who says, let me share my subjectivity with you, is inviting the baby into a different level of experience with her. And now, how does that happen? Just one second. That is a developmental issue, and that has to do with development of babies. And that is a little bit, I'll just give you, for those of you who, when you hear the word Piaget, you don't faint. Oh, you haven't even heard? Okay. Piaget was the Swiss developmental psychologist who also wrote books that nobody could understand. Or I had this conversation with Gabi about why people write so it's hard to understand. With Piaget, it was just a matter of, after the fifth book, it became easy. There's a whole bunch of authors like that after the fifth book, it becomes easy. So Piaget defined how babies develop based on an N of 6. He had 6 children. He followed his own children, but he could follow them well. It wasn't a laboratory. And Piaget's view was that something happens. You know, he's Swiss, so tick, 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 tock. So something happens at the right time, and the baby goes from bringing the world to the way he sees it to changing the way he sees it to accommodate to the world. Those of you who tried to break your head on Piaget, that's called decentering. That originally there's what's called somatosensory assimilation, which means, in simple terms, that when I see it and I'm reaching for it, it's there, and when I'm not seeing it and reaching for it, it's not there. And around 9 months, the baby starts to understand that even when I'm not seeing it and reaching for it, it actually is there. So what's it? It's not about me. It's about it, right? That happens around 9 months, and once that starts to happen, the mother also becomes something like that. How you coordinate those different ways of looking at it is that's a whole course. But that's what, it's about some kind of development that happens. You know.
Sorry to interrupt, but no, I'm not sending a message that there's a black Honda that's blocking the kitchen and a truck needs to get in, so if it belongs to anyone, please.
Thank you. No black Hondas in this room. Okay. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if developmentally there's an innate curiosity that the baby wants to look out of the window and see what the mother's looking at. Because what if they don't have that curiosity?
Right. Those are developmental questions that are very important, but we don't have answers for them. It'll take us far afield from we're making use of self-object in order to move to relationships. And, you know, if everybody's interested in delving into how you coordinate individual or baby development with family systems, so maybe we'll have a special day sometime, or, you know, we'll talk about development and family development. We've been thinking about what kind of extra things we might want to do. Maybe that's something, but not this moment. Yeah.
Yeah, so like similar, like where does like the baby's innate personality come in?
I'm sorry?
Like the baby's like innate personality, you guys feel like, oh, there's a doggy, I'm like, the baby doesn't react to that. Like maybe he doesn't care for a dog, he cares for a bird. Like it's not just because I'm doing it, he's doing it. Is there such a...
It's together. The self-object interacts with, in other words, a baby who's more curious may be able to make a mother into an adequate self-object by seducing her, by saying, whereas a baby who's less robust with the same mother who's, let's say, depressed, it's going to fail.
So it's not like they become or develop, it's based on us. They have their own innate.
Right.
It's a
But babies bring something to development. In other words, nobody believes what was awfully important for a certain period of time to believe, which is that babies are born as a blank slate, and that the world does whatever it wants with them. That's certainly not the case. It's certainly not the case with language. It's certainly not the case with major development. There's an interaction between what the baby brings. Now, what does the baby bring is also a long nice. There's no agreement about it. There was a school in New York, actually she was my teacher, Stella Chess, who talked about, there was something called the New York longitudinal study, where they studied babies from birth until 20, and said, well, what did the baby bring that continued, right? And they had 9 kinds of aspects of temperament, and the British added 10, just haha. And that was very interesting. It was very helpful for parents to understand how the baby was bringing it. It didn't pan out when you looked at it in research. When you looked at it in research, what panned out was that babies come with a level of activity. Some babies are more active, some babies are less active. That seems to continue throughout life. The rest of it seems to be more malleable than the temperamental studies. But there were temperamental studies going on for 30 years because it was important.
אפשר להפריע?
אתה לא מפריע, אתה פה.
יש מישהו on the civic, אפורה? זה מישהו שעובד בשערי צדק? עם הדקה של שערי צדק לא קשור? תודה.
Let's make a decision as a class. I don't mind going slowly, but do you want to go slowly? Do you want to go faster? Is this space okay? It's okay? Okay. Isn't that? Yeah, we have time this semester. We're not in a rush. Yeah.
When you say like the 9 different types of temperament,
Yeah.
where does personality come into that? Like a child's, is that the same thing? Is that
No, the reason that the word temperament was used was that there are aspects that are not, they're not, put it this way, it's the floor of development. Did you talk with Barbara about what's called developmental lines?
Yeah.
Okay. So in developmental lines, you know, the idea is that you're born with certain stuff. It's like the floor of development. Then you connect them together. That's like the walls of development. And when you're used to feeling that you can connect things all the time, that's like the ceiling of development. That's where the personality is, right? These are the building blocks of it, but the question is what you do with them. What you do with them and how you work with them in the world. Okay?
you're saying that that's malleable according to how you're raised or who's with you or your self-object? Is that?
Well, but put it this way, most people find that talking about temperament is very useful. When I was in pediatrics, the person who was teaching me said, it doesn't matter if it's true, it's so useful. It doesn't, well, who cares if it's true, right? And there's something to be said for a lot of things like that. In other words, it's a way of organizing information. Some babies just run at you when there's something new, and some babies run backwards when there's something new. That was one of the temperamental characteristics. It's useful to see that. Does it pan out over time in 1,000 babies? So what? Right? It doesn't pan out, but maybe the way of looking at it in research is different than in life. But that would be, see, let's say you have a baby who withdraws. This approach or withdrawal is one of the Chess and Thomas temperamental aspects. Approach or withdrawal. You have a baby who's an approacher and a mother who's depressed. That's a bracha, right? So the baby's going to bring her out. If you have a mother who's depressed and a baby who's a withdrawer, it's not going to work. If the mother is anxious and post-trauma and the baby is a withdrawer, that's going to let the mother rest a little bit. The baby is into things all the time and the mother is tense and post-trauma, so it's going to explode. So you see, you're always dealing both with what the baby brings and how it interacts, and you'll see that in families. If we bring it back now to the self-object, so what we're talking about is that the self itself is always being supported or being glued together by things that happen from the outside. And to build a coherent self, you need both a regulatory self-object, and then you need a regulatory self-object who's able to transform into subjective self-object. Now, when you think about families and you say, if mother is narcissistic, for example, and she needs to be the best mother possible, so she's likely to stay regulatory. She's likely to say, you know, I get you to smile. I get you to be happy. I get you to quiet down. It's all about me, right? And then look what a great mother I am. It's not so easy for that mother to say, you have a different view of things than I do. I'm sharing you the tree that I'm seeing, and you are seeing your doggy. No, look at the tree. I'm trying to show you the tree. I'm a wonderful mother. I'm showing you the tree. That's regulation instead of intersubjective. The baby says, I can be a subject too, and the mother says, excuse me, there's one subject here, right? The mother stays regulatory, and the baby finds it hard to develop intersubjective experience. Those are the kinds of things you see as difficulties. Yeah. No.
So in that case, would the baby not be able to regulate itself without the mother?
Say that again?
In such a case.
What?
In such a case as you described, with a narcissistic mother, would the baby only, like as the baby develops, would it not be able to regulate without the mother?
Right. In other words, if the mother is always regulating the baby, you'll have a baby that doesn't regulate itself. When that baby goes to Gan, it's not going to be simple. And then the mother comes and says, well, with me, he's fine. What's the matter with you? And the problem isn't with the Ganenet, it's with the mother, that she keeps him so attuned just to her that he can't go on and be regulated by himself and then look for intersubjective. What goes on in the Gan is more intersubjective, right? Yeah.
You see mothers that have a problem doing that.
You see, guys, we talk about babies, the left side of the room needs to know enough.
We're out to lunch.
What's that?
We're out to lunch.
You're out to lunch, right? But we'll be back, right? Yeah. It's good for you, because if you listen carefully, this is what she's been talking about all along. Yeah.
You see mothers who have an issue, they have a hard time giving the child a subjective. They just, is it like I'm saying, I've seen mothers like that. So there's a problem for them to do that, to be able to teach the child the subjective.
Right. So you don't teach your child the subjective, that's the whole problem. You teach the regulation. You share the intersubjective. The intersubjective experience that makes somebody else participate intersubjectively is not something I give them. It's something that I allow them to develop and that I give privilege to. I'm interested in who you are as a subject, as much as I'm interested in your seeing me as a subject. That's why it's called intersubjective. So the mother who thinks she has to teach subjective experience.
If a mother doesn't share, it happens, mothers don't share.
Right.
What does that mean? She wasn't
Right. Wait. Now we're dealing with families, right? So what is the most common reason that the mother isn't into intersubjective experience? The most common reason is that she has a husband who's not interested in her as a subject. In other words, that she's feeling that her intersubjective experience is being limited, and so she stays to regulation with the baby. So we discovered the family, right? In other words, when you say, well, this mother,
Well, she didn't have her mother share with her.
right? So there's intergenerational, and there's right here and now. So let's say she didn't have a mother. That was a while ago, right? She has this guy she's living with right now, and a lot of times what you'll find is that if you focus on what's the matter with the mother, which people did for generations, right? And you don't say, wait a minute, what's her self-object world like, right? Who is there for her? You find she's all alone, and she is unable to ask. Maybe she has a husband who's willing to do it, but she doesn't ask him to, and she just says, let's just regulate. And so if you work with the couple, she becomes a better mother, right? Now, is that supposed to happen? According to the subjective model, no. What on earth does how he treats her have to do with her inner experience as a mother and what her mother did? But they do interact, right? Because the self-object function is lifelong. It's not something that was done. It's not a done deal. It was finished. It's something that's happening all the time. So when you see a couple, you're saying to yourself, is this couple being able to work intersubjectively? And if they're not able to work intersubjectively, what are they losing? What are they missing in their own lives? And what is that that's going to affect how they'll be with their children? And we have a question from the men.
So this theory, or what do you call it, but
way of looking at things.
Way of looking at things
that's what the word theory means. And in Greek, it means the look. Yeah.
Greek?
In Greek, yeah.
And Swiss?
Andromizer.
So this idea that, let's say, the mother's having a hard time to be intersubjective with her child because her intersubjective world is weakened by not having intersubjectivity with her husband.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't have to do with a husband-wife, which means, let's say a woman's not married, or let's say she can get an intersubjective, if she gets an intersubjective relationship with somebody else, in order for me to have intersubjectivity with somebody else, do I need to come intersubjective already?
Right, so it's a very good question. You'll meet some adolescent girls, we're going to get to adolescents soon, right? You'll meet some adolescent girls who will say, this teacher woke me up. This teacher made me feel human. When I was in her class, something happened that never happened to me before. And you'll find it sometimes with the guys in the yeshiva. They say, oh, this is not just a mashgiach, this is somebody who understands in a completely different way and makes me, our terms, feel that I can be an intersubjective human being, right? So that's why it's important to see it as a lifelong function. It's not limited to a spouse. It's very important in the spouse subsystem. But it's not. Nothing is limited. You know, it'd be better if it happens because you're there all the time.
Right.
But
so technically, if the mother gets an intersubjective relationship with the therapist, she could become a better mother also.
Right. We would hope that she would also be able to look for it in her spouse. Sometimes what therapy does is it diminishes the possibility of looking for it in the spouse subsystem, and people are in wonderful therapy but divorce. So you have to be careful about who you are and who the other people are. In America we say, who are your people, right? Your therapist is not supposed to be one of your people. He's supposed to help you to discover your people. Okay, a few more questions from the left side here.
So,
Wait, you've already asked, so.
Just about the exact terminology, this plays out with kids. For example, let's say there's a noise and the mom's with the kid. So if the mother says, oh, I hear a tractor, that's regulatory, but if she asks the kid, what do you hear, that would be subjective.
No. If she says, listen to the tractor, that's regulatory. If she says, I hear something, I think it's a tractor, that's subjective.
Okay.
So it's an invitation to intersubjective.
Okay.
Okay? You guys are working harder with trying to nail this than I thought you would. And that's very good. Do you still have your question, or was that your question? You had a question about a tractor?
Basically, use the dog.
Okay,
Saving.
good, okay. So moving from yeah.
I keep thinking about like a current clinical example. I don't know if you want to hear, but
Do we want to hear? We're all intersubjective here, we want to
well,
hear.
I have like a 21-year-old young pregnant client who grew up basically with just her mother. And I can't help but wonder, like, I wish I knew more, and I don't even know if she knows more about like the very beginning. Her father ended up leaving
When she was,
5.
okay.
But just yesterday we were talking about all like
But
she's
I just can't, so 5 sessions from now, we're going to be saying, and when her baby is 5, she's going to revisit something, isn't she? We'll get to that later, but
Well,
anyway, she hasn't had
right,
the baby
those
yet.
things
no.
are in mind. But I was just thinking about like just yesterday we were talking about different ways that she's similar to her mother, because we have talked about a lot in terms of narcissism. And this whole thing is just exploding in my mind now because she's about to become a mother herself, and she was talking about different ways yesterday that she is similar to her mother in terms of wanting to control certain things, and it seems like a topic that we could talk about before she gives birth.
Okay. So that's a marvelous explosion, because you're saying, wait a second, when you face off with this new creature, what's going to happen with you? What's it going to bring up for you? What is it going to scare you about? And where along the developmental path is it going to work easier, and is it going to be more difficult, right? So now you have a developmental path of a baby who's not yet born yet,
Right.
right? But you're saying probably if she and her mother are good regulators together, that she's going to be good at regulating, and maybe too good at regulating, and that it may be that she gets so good at regulating that it's going to be hard for her to go to the intersubjective. And then you're asking yourself, okay, so how do we do therapy with the future? Therapy with the future. You're talking about the future. That's why it's exploding in your mind, because you're thinking about the risks and the opportunities. And then you say to yourself, so what would we do here? Should we finish the therapy when she has the baby? And you say, oh, okay, well, you're busy with the baby, and there's a baby, and it's just a baby, and so, take care of the baby and come back for therapy some other time. Or we say, here, this is the opportunity of your life to take this, to take you and your baby, you and your mother. Grandma's going to be around, so there's a very rich issue here that maybe can be taken beyond where it was before. But that would mean that we're actually doing therapy in real time, not in past time, right? We're thinking past, but we're doing it in the present and the future. Can you do that in therapy? Not in Freudian therapy with adults, but what happened with Anna Freud when she started to see children, she said, here we have a 3-year-old who is afraid that his father's going to castrate him. That's metaphorical, but he's afraid that there's something going to be with the father and something's going to happen to his body. Well, I can't exactly go back into associations about it because it's happening now in real time. So actually therapy happens in real time. All of child therapy happens in real time. And here you're dealing with a mother and a baby. Therapy happens in real time. There are opportunities. Family therapy knows that. In family therapy, we go from here forward. We don't go only backwards, right? So you would say, let's have, she's married, right?
Yeah.
Oh, so now we have a question about a husband being involved, or what on earth is a father, right? So you have an opportunity to experience everything differently, and that's very rich. And if she sees that, now, has she repressed that? No. But she doesn't see it yet. She doesn't see that she's working on what could be a better father than her father. How she could be a different mother than her mother. Is her mother going to plus if she starts to act different from the way her mother? So everything is going on all at once. That's what's called family therapy.
Right.
If you're not going to address the past, then the feelings of the past also go.
Well, if we wanted to say, okay, listen, come lie on the couch and let's figure out all these repressed things. And then by the time your baby is about 5 or 6, you'll have figured it out. Real time is happening now. This is the opportunity now.
Yeah, but I'm saying when she has those feelings and she feels how it felt, she's able to see, to become really aware of what was it for her and how, and then she can change it. But
Right.
if she doesn't experience the difficulty she had with that, she cannot relate to the difficulty her child will
Right.
have.
Yes and no, because some of those difficulties are right here under our nose. They're going on pragmatically in how she talks to her mother about her baby. It's not just recalling what happened in the past. There's a combination of them. So that's a good example. So that's it's good that that exploded. And then you're dealing with a new opportunity. One of the things we do in family therapy is we look for opportunities, or actually what we almost always say when a family comes to us is, what is the opportunity to experience things differently? And the reason that makes a difference is because of the self-objects. You see, before Kohat, you would say, well, something needs to be experienced differently, but it can't be until you have all the insights into what happened in the past. So just freeze time. And by the way, I don't know if you know it, but that's what Freud used to do. People would come to Vienna, not all the people there were Viennese. People would come to Vienna and he would say, freeze time. That's it. You don't get married, you don't make decisions, you don't change your work. You come it's all about me. You come, you figure things out, and then you'll be able to live in the world. How long were those therapies? 6 months, a year and a half. When therapies got to be longer than that, then Freud said, oh my God, we're not dealing just with the past, we're also dealing with the present. He never figured out what to do about that, so he wrote a book called Analysis, Terminable and Interminable. Can you ever finish analysis? You see, the muddle, right? But that's what we deal with all the time. There's something there that's right under our nose. It's not repressed, and it hasn't even yet happened, but there are opportunities to create different self-object experiences, and that changes things. Okay. Yeah.
Just thinking about Avital's case though,
What's that?
about Avital's case.
Right.
So, I mean, obviously our client is not aware of intersubjective and regulatory. How would you use this knowledge to help
Avital's client? Well, this is going to be the connection with adolescents. Most adolescents, at some point, say to themselves, is my future my past? That's a simple statement, right? In other words, am I going to be a father like my father? Do I want to have a family like my family? Do I want it to be in some ways better? Hopefully, I want it to be in some ways better. Because what people do is they give their children the possibility to do better than they did. You know, the best you can do with your family is to launch children who can do some things you couldn't do, right? Everybody has their limitations. So every adolescent is asking that kind of a question. And sometimes it freaks them out, and sometimes it gives them hope, and sometimes it makes them despair. And they say, you know, with this kind of, you know, what am I supposed to do with this? So I'll just settle for God knows what. But the issue is there. So this young woman of 21 is not far from adolescence, is she? Right? So we could ask her, like, yesterday, when you were thinking, you know, about your family, there were some problems there. Your father disappeared. It's a pretty big problem. Your grandmother, God knows what. You know, look at the whole family and say, did you imagine how it might be different? And there were adolescents who would say, that's what keeps me alive, imagining that it could be different. And there are adolescents who say, I don't want it to be different. I just want it to be exactly the same. And that, you know, my mother will tell me how to be a mother and that'll be fine. And there are adolescents who say, I just can't do it. You know, it can never be better. It'll probably be worse because look at how limited I am. And that's something we need to know about. That's not repressed, right? That's not repressed. That's something that you can talk about. Adolescents, do something with that. So that's where you can pull back to it. That was her question. I guess you got the answer. Was it your question? Or?
No.
Great. Okay. Anyway, that's where, when you're dealing with starting a family, if you think about it, where do you need to go? Back to adolescence, right? If you want to know, people in their 20s, but people in their 50s too, if you want to know what the troubles are, one good place to go back to is, and when you were 16, how did you think about it? What were your hopes? What were your fears? What did you imagine? What did you think you needed? And, you know, how is that connected to what you're doing now? That will lead me to just explain today's targil. What we're trying to do is to pull all of these strands together to understand how families with adolescents are different and how adolescence is such a challenge and how all the strains are brought together. Now, just for those of you who want to say, but Freud thought that it's really about early development. What does adolescence have to do with anything? I'll just remind you that in one of his cases, Freud made the following statement. He said, you can never, he was dealing with adults, he never treated children, except for one blown case that's hilarious that we talked about. Freud dealt with adults. He said, you really cannot get past adolescence. When you're talking to a patient, the person is telling you about his early childhood as he thought about it as an adolescent. That's the closest you can get, as he thought about it as an adolescent. He said it's sort of like, you know, the founding myths of Rome. They make up a story about Romulus and Remus and God knows what, and that's the founding myth. Adolescents create founding myths. They create a way of pulling together their self-story. And the childhood that you think you're getting to is the childhood that the adolescent was able to put together. Going back to it beyond adolescence is actually impossible. Those of you who know Melanie Klein know that she disagreed. And obviously this was a statement that's a little bit exaggerated, but it's an important point because, you know, the idea that you can actually get back to who you were when you were 3, Freud didn't think so. He thought I was getting back to what, when I was an adolescent, I thought about myself at 3. That's as far back as we can get. So from our point of view, if you say, well, let's try to understand the founding myth. Let's try to understand, when you say personality, for example, when do you have a personality? So it was always agreed in psychiatry, if anything can be agreed in psychiatry, that you don't make a diagnosis of a personality disorder until 18, because you don't have a personality yet. You're in the middle of putting it together. Personality isn't the floor, personality is the ceiling, right? So how do you put it together? How do you do all this together? And once you put it together, can you actually get back to the pieces before you put it together? Not exactly, not in a concrete way.
Why not? That's very confusing to me. Like, how can you make a statement like that? Why can't you do that?
Because the person you're talking to can't deconstruct the ceiling and deconstruct the walls and just give you the floor. You can't do that. Once you've created the structure, you're talking from within the structure. And the structure has to hold its own coherence, and that interferes with understanding what exactly happened. And that's, he's talking about psychoanalysis.
So your memory is tainted.
Your memory is not tainted. Your memory is a process and not a content. Is that clear to everybody? There is no such thing as
Process and not a
content. In other words, the old idea that memory is something that you just, like with a computer, just adds more files. There are no files. From the beginning, you begin to remember as you put it together. Memory is an active process, and as a result, there is no objective memory. It just doesn't exist. But there's ways of talking about the past that can be very useful, but don't take them concretely. They're not facts. They're ways that are reflecting the facts. And you see what I mean? Now, it's not somebody who's critical of Freud who's saying it. It's Freud himself. His followers didn't like the idea that you couldn't get back to early childhood, because Melanie Klein thought we're always dealing with only early childhood. That was a bit of a fantasy, but Freud at least thought that way. For us, it's important, because then we say in families, okay, before you built the family, how were you thinking about it when you were 16? Who influenced that? What was hopeful and what was not so hopeful? So the targil we're going to do today, in a few minutes, is about taking ourselves as adolescents and going through We haven't finished exactly all of the review, but going through the whole review, because you've heard it once, and trying to figure out how it informs how I saw things as an adolescent. You may need the whole time just to talk to each other today. If you do, then next week we'll continue with it. And so take the sheet home, continue to think about it, and we'll have the discussion about it in small groups more perhaps next week than we will today. Now, there were two or three things that we wanted to mention that are procedural. One is a notion that I think we all agree on, if there's something we can all agree on here, and that is v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. We're all there, you know, that's an important... now, that means that when you're in a room, and you leave the room, and somebody else is coming into the room, that you leave the room the way you would want it to be left for you. It's not a big deal, it's simple, but it's an important focus for us. And I say that because there's, you know, I came to the Family Institute because I think the Family Institute is the most wonderful clinic that I've ever experienced in terms of the feelings between people, the way that people are trained. But we want to, you know, make that a little bit more concrete. And one of the things that you do when you leave a room, if you're taking seriously v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, is to say, okay, how am I leaving the room? Because somebody else is coming in, that's one of us, is coming into the room. And to be mindful to that, I think, is a good exercise. It's sort of, you know, a kind of meditation. It's not something you necessarily like to do, but it's a kiyum that I think is important in terms of how we treat each other. And how we treat each other is connected to how we treat our clients. So that's just a push for that. If you can keep it in mind and we see that it improves, I'll be very pleased. I will say that the Family Institute has gone one more notch higher in that.
I just want to bring up a point. I don't know if I leave the room or don't leave the room thing, but as far as starters thinking about what might get in the way, is so much is going on at the end of the session while you're taking care of the client. They almost don't have room to think about what exactly the room is. So,
right, absolutely.
So the question is how to address that.
How would you address it?
I just brought up a point. Give me a second.
Everybody's going to address it somehow differently. But when you're leaving the room, that room somebody else is coming into. So you're not alone.
We've heard it a bunch of times, and apparently that's...
What?
We've heard that this, I'm saying, is
right.
This a bunch of times, and apparently it's not enough.
Can I suggest something?
Yes.
I think that if we keep to time, because we have the 10 minutes between the hours, and if we keep to time, then you have the time to 5 minutes to get out of the room, another person 5 minutes to get into the room and get themselves ready to receive their client, like very
But it's 2 minutes
present.
till you get upstairs, and then it's another 3 minutes till you write the receipt, and you like sort of finish out the session. By that time, it's maybe a minute left to go think about the room and go back to it.
I clean up my room while I walk out to my client. I take the stuff with me when I know someone else is.
Apparently it's like,
Yeah.
This is an important discussion.
I second the motion by time.
Let's, obviously, there are as many ideas about this. Whoa. There are as many thoughts about this as there are people in the room, and since we're Jews, maybe more. But let me suggest that we continue this on the blog. It's about